Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and in some previous videos, I've asked you, the viewer, to leave questions about how some classic games worked. Well, they haven't gone unnoticed. I've read every single one, and this is the first video where I'm going to directly respond to some of these, to hopefully answer some long-standing mysteries that you may have had in your head for around, 30 years or so. If you've asked a question in the comments of one of my previous videos, be on the lookout to see if it appears in this one. Even if you didn't specifically ask a question, maybe you've wondered the same thing as someone who has. Before we get stuck into it, I just want to quickly say that I've been extremely humbled by all the positive feedback and growth my channel has seen from this series of retro console tech videos. These take a lot of my personal time to put together, and it's fantastic to see that you guys are enjoying them, and it inspires me to keep going. It really has been amazing to see the community growing, and it's all thanks to you guys, so thank you. Alright, on to the video. Let's kick off some queries related to the Sega Mega Drive first. This question comes from NanoDrive. I would love an explanation of how Vic Tokai, that's the developer, achieves the Mode 7-like rotating cylinder background in Stage 6 of Battlemania 2. Alright, let's take a look. Battlemania 2, or Battlemania Daiginjou, was a Japanese-only Mega Drive game that I talked about in my Shadow and Highlight video. Their question isn't about Shadow and Highlight though, it's about this effect we see here. This is something that we saw the Super Nintendo doing with Mode 7 and HD Matrix from time to time, but Sega's machine couldn't do that, so what's happening here? If you have a guess, pause the video here and comment below, then continue to see if you are right. Ready? As you may have suspected, this is created using line scroll, although it's an interesting implementation. The lines aren't scrolling at different speeds like we normally see, they are all moving at the same speed. Instead, line scroll is used to slightly offset each line to create the illusion of a curve. As you can see, to complete the effect, the two planes have their line scrolls actually inverted. If you're looking at it left to right, plane A, or the foreground plane, is using a concave shape, whereas plane B, or the background plane, is using a convex shape. As the level scrolls right to left, this, combined with a bit of vertical scrolling, creates the effect of travelling through a rotating tunnel. How did you do? Did you get it right? Let's see how you go with the next one. Solo Wing Fury mentions they had a long-standing mystery of how the split screen effect that's going on in Stage 6 of Castlevania Bloodlines was achieved. This one is a pretty common head-scratcher. It's actually almost the same effect you see earlier in the game, with the reflections in the water in Stage 2. What Konami did here was use raster effects to split the screen. As I've covered before, the most common application of this was to change the colour palette partway down the screen, but that's not all you could do with the technique. In this case, each segment shows different sets of sprites with their own attributes. In fact, it's swapping the entire sprite attribute table, either to make the reflections in the water or to create the split effect in the castle. It's also used to apply shadow and highlight mode in alternating segments to make them visually distinct and make a more convincing reflection. In the case of the water, in addition to all of this, it's using raster effects to create vertical scaling as well, to achieve the illusion that the water is moving up and down, which is also something I've previously spoken about. The foreground plane actually looks like this, so raster effects are used to stretch or compress the bottom half of the plane. Returning to the castle effect, line scroll is then used to offset each of the segments, and unlike what we just saw Battlemania 2 doing, these line scroll values actually do change as you progress through the level. Retro Game Mechanics Explained has a really technical explanation into exactly how this works, complete with a code breakdown, so if you're interested in learning more, you should check that video out. Keeper7Keys 2003 asks, can you make a video explaining how the last boss scaling effect was achieved in the game The Lawnmower Man? Sure thing, let's do it. For context, they are referring to the Mega Drive version of the game with this question, so here it is in action, and we can see the really cool looking scaling that's going on with the giant head. It looks really smooth and seamless, doesn't it? Almost Mode 7-ish. This one proved to be a bit of a challenge to figure out, because the game didn't play nice with debuggers for some reason, but I think I've got it. Let's take a look at what's going on with the plane the head is on. As it's not a sprite, it's actually on plane A, the foreground plane. The head is animated to open and close its mouth, but look at what happens when it gets bigger. It's specifically animated to stretch out horizontally and become wider. Okay, that's interesting, but how does that translate to appearing larger in the game? Well, I've actually just covered it when I talked about Castlevania. It's using raster scaling effects. That animated horizontal stretching and contracting is combined with raster vertical stretching and contracting, and doing this at the same time scales the head larger or smaller. Two different techniques to achieve a common goal. That's really clever. Who needs Mode 7, right? Speaking of Mode 7, the initial question wasn't asking about the Super Nintendo version, but let's compare it with the Mega Drive to see how they did it there, as it'll be a good way to transition to the Super Nintendo related questions. The fight clearly looks different between the two versions, but the giant scaling head is common to both. The Super Nintendo is using Mode 7, but oddly enough, not for the giant head. Instead, it's using it for the background to make it rotate and zoom in and out. The scaling head is just good old-fashioned fake scaling. Unlike the Mega Drive, the head here is a sprite, and the tiles that make up the head are stored in memory in a few different sizes, and the game swaps between them as needed to make the head expand and contract. Because it's done on a per tile basis, and there's more sizes than you might typically see, the effect looks smoother than it usually is when you see this being done, especially at full speed. Alright, let's move on to the Super Nintendo and start with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time. A few viewers had the same question about this game actually. Captain Nintendo, Alan Car Bravo 1, and Conanarian. They want to know how Konami managed to get two independent turtles scaling and rotating during the time travel cutscenes. Mode 7 only allows for one background layer after all, so what's going on here? I've actually partially explained this in the previous video, but in case you didn't see that, this is using the Super Nintendo's trick of splitting the screen on a specified scanline and displaying a different image in each segment. But that's not the full answer. There's actually some more trickery going on here than you might have expected. The first thing that happens is the level image zooms out using Mode 7 in the middle of the screen. Then once it starts blinking, it changes to a sprite. At this point, the screen splits on scanline 114, almost exactly right across the middle. The two turtles then appear and start flying towards the screen. The game is displaying Mode 7 in both the top and bottom segments, with each turtle in their own segment. You'll notice that throughout the whole cutscene, they never cross over to the other half of the screen. Now, if you watched my video about really creative uses of Mode 7, you would have seen some examples of games that did this and managed to display a different part of the Mode 7 tile map in each segment. So naturally, you might just assume that must be what's going on here too. Obviously, each turtle is in a different part of the tile map, and the game is just referencing the correct location for each one. Well, believe it or not, that's not what's happening. You might have spotted that each turtle is visually identical in these scenes except for their colours. They don't even have their initial on their belt. So what's the easiest and most efficient way to change the turtle? That's right, a simple palette swap. The Mode 7 tile map looks like this. It just has one turtle in two poses, showing their front and their back. In the top half of the screen, it's rendering the tile map with one palette, and then in the bottom half, it's rendering it with another palette. And it's only needing to swap two colours to do this, colour index A and B in palette 0. Pretty neat, huh? Staying with TMNT4 for this next question, a designer perspective wants to know, how on earth the Mode 7 Neon Knight Riders level has what appear to be two separate parallax independently scrolling Mode 7 layers stacked on top of each other, with the lower grid looking layer and the upper track layer clearly scaling, rotating and moving independently one above the other. Apparently they've wondered this their whole life and nobody's been able to figure it out. Alright, let's fix that. Here's the level in motion, and you can see what the question is referring to. That orange grid under the track appears to be scrolling at a different rate to the track itself. This is just one single Mode 7 tile map being used here, and it's also not using EXTBG. Before I reveal the answer, have a guess in the comments and then see how you did. The explanation for this is actually really straightforward. The grid is made up of a repeating pattern made up of just 4 unique tiles, and they've been set up to form a simple 2-frame animation as the level is moving. Because they are part of the same tile map as the track, the direction the animation moves in changes depending on the direction of the track. The camera angle does the rest to make it look like it's a lot lower in altitude. So there you go, mate, that answers your lifelong question. Before I get to this next one, I need to give a bit of context. In my video about amazing uses of Mode 7, I covered the game Melfan Stories, and how it split the screen to show two different Mode 7 calculations in two different locations of the tile map. It was the only game I knew of that did it, and I asked viewers if they could think of any others. I got a lot of responses suggesting to take a look at Super Soccer, also known as Super Formation Soccer. Among those that suggested this were Chauncey Gardner, Ciaro Bobo, Techno Estate, Fato Mandebu, Wheeljack2K, Nukatron, and Johans Tube. Who am I to refuse? Let's check it out. So just eyeballing it, it definitely looks like it's doing the same kind of thing Melfan Stories was doing. The crowd, advertising boards and net in the background are scaling to show them getting closer or farther away, and the camera positioned on the field moves up and down to follow the direction of the ball, in pretty typical Mode 7 fashion. If you look closely though, you'll notice that while they do look similar, they definitely aren't the same. So what's this game doing differently? Unlike Melfan Stories, there's no screen split happening here. The part with the net in the crowd is connected to the field. It's just one single Mode 7 screen that looks like this. But it's still somehow performing two different Mode 7 calculations at once despite this. If I enable what I like to call view lines in the debugger, we can see what's happening. There's a group of tightly clumped lines at the end of the usual cone shape that correspond to the stuff at the far end. As the camera on the field moves closer to the goal, the view lines from the field start packing into the lines on the grandstand, bunching them together even tighter while also making them shorter. The process is reversed if the ball is travelling away from the goal. The end result is a pretty unique looking game, and yet another clever use of Mode 7. Also in that video, I talk about how games like Super Off-Road the Baja used Mode 7 to create undulating height. One game I didn't mention to do this though was Taz-Mania, and Albert Hammock1 asks whether it's also doing the same thing. Time to take out our Acme magnifying glass and investigate. So here's the game in action. The Super Nintendo version is a weird racing game of sorts, and it definitely looks like the same effect. But it might surprise you to know that not only is the game not using Mode 7, there's also not even a screen split. The whole game is being rendered using Mode 1. But there's still some interesting tricks at work here. The HUD on the left side of the screen is on layer 3 and doesn't change. The sky and some of the mountains at the top of the screen are on layer 2, and this is also pretty constant, with the game adjusting the scrolling position accordingly. Nothing too unusual so far. Where it gets interesting is what happens on background layer 1. The tile map looks like this. When the scan line is in the top part of the screen, it draws the close set of mountains. When it gets to the bottom part of the screen, it moves to the part of the tile map that's used for the track. But wait a moment, that doesn't look like a track. These weird cone shapes are what the track is comprised of, consisting of thin and wide sections to make up the road, and flat sections that form crossroads. The scrolling moves to the relevant part of this image that's required to construct the road at that point, and line scrolling on each scan line converts it into what's seen in the final game, specifically to create curves and bends. Parts of the tile map also perform quick palette swaps to sell the illusion of movement. It's not too dissimilar to how other consoles like the Mega Drive made the effect. Since the Mega Drive version was actually completely different, I'm not sure why Sunsoft opted not to utilise the strengths of the Super Nintendo with this game. Maybe they wanted to use Mode 7, but couldn't figure out how to create the undulating height they wanted, so decided on this solution instead. If you're enjoying this content and want to see more of it, don't forget to subscribe so you know when I upload new videos. Let's unpack a couple of shoot 'em ups next. David Aitken8503 says he wants to understand what is going on with the first level boss in Space Megaforce. It's large with a spherical portion in the centre that disconnects and rotates. There appears to be tiles behind it as the ground is quite detailed. Is the entire ground constructed of sprites, or did they somehow keep the last tile screen in memory before switching to Mode 7? Just what is going on here? Okay, let's find out. So this is the boss he's talking about. It's a huge robot looking thing with a big pulsing sphere in the middle. As the fight progresses, the boss extends its ends down to create walls on either side, then the ball detaches and starts rotating. What he's asking is how the developers Compile managed to make the sphere rotate with Mode 7 while keeping the main boss and the background so detailed. What if I told you that this scene isn't actually using Mode 7 at all? Well, it's not. The game is actually using Mode 1 here. The boss is on background layer 1 and the ground below is on background layer 2, which is why they can both be so detailed. Background layer 3 actually doesn't have anything on it during this fight, but is used during the level itself before you reach the boss for clouds that use color mats to become transparent. And don't forget, I have a video all about how the Super Nintendo did that effect as well. Back to the boss though, and how that sphere is rotating like that. We've established it's not part of a background layer, so that means it's a sprite, even when it's attached to the main boss. The rotation in this case is not done with Mode 7, but is instead accomplished by animation. You can see it pretty clearly by checking out the tiles that make up the ball's sprite. They change and update each frame to create an animation as it's spinning. They use enough frames of animation to make it look pretty smooth when the game's running at full speed. Sometimes the solution is a lot simpler than you thought. Dinosaur Arcade asks, I'd like to know how R-Type 3 did the bullets for the first boss. The first boss is in the distance firing the scaling and rotating bullets into the foreground. It's not one bullet at a time, there might be 4 bullets flying towards you at once. Maybe you've also played this game and had the same question. Let's open it up. The boss fight they are talking about in R-Type 3 is this one. The actual boss enemy is in the background there and is firing at the player in the foreground, and we can clearly see up to 4 spinning shots coming towards us at once. But then the boss itself also starts scaling as it moves closer to the camera and into the player's range so they can actually shoot it. Mode 7 is being used for this fight, but not for the projectiles the boss is firing. It's only used for the boss itself. As for how they are getting bigger, the game's just using the good old method of using different sizes of sprites to fake the scaling. And being sprites, there can be as many on the screen as the sprite limit allows. In fact, at the beginning of the fight, the boss itself is also a sprite until it changes to a Mode 7 background. Developer Tamtex did manage some pretty impressive Mode 7 effects in this game. This rotating hexagonal prism earlier in the background of level 1 comes to mind, but there's no complex tricks with this boss fight. It proves you don't need to be fancy in order to be effective. Next on the list we have Super Metroid, and a couple of viewers, Captain Nintendo and Fez the Space Biker, had the same question. They want to know how the opening and ending sequence of the game was done. I'm not one to pass up an opportunity to talk about Super Metroid, so I'm happy to oblige. Let's enable our scan visor and analyse it. We'll study the opening first. We see 2 sequences, essentially. The first is Samus flying her ship towards the space colony. Breaking it down to the individual components, we see that Samus's ship is indeed a Mode 7 background, while everything else in the scene, including the space colony and all of the asteroids, is made up of sprites. Remember, sprites can be set to a number of priorities to appear in front of or behind background layers, including Mode 7 backgrounds. The second scene is when the space colony explodes and Samus flies her ship away from it. This is done a bit differently because, as you can see, the space colony moves into the distance before it explodes and we see Samus' ship flying away. How was this done? They can't both be Mode 7, can they? Well, yeah, they can, and it's not even using the trick of having 2 different images on the same tile map, even though they could have easily done that. The game's actually swapping the Mode 7 tile map on the fly, from the one that contains the space station to the one that contains Samus' ship. It's just a straight swap. Samus' ship simply replaces the space station, with the transition covered up by the explosion effect. The introduction then completes as we see Samus flying to planet Zebes. As for the ending, this is a little more complex. The first thing we see is the planet Zebes zooming out as an animated Mode 7 background. As it does this, some yellow clouds move across the screen from the left and the right. These are sprites, with colour mats applied to make them transparent. It then briefly fades out, then back in, swapping the Mode 7 background to grey clouds. This then starts zooming out, and once again we see the yellow cloud sprites appear, this time from the top and the bottom. This also eventually fades out to swap the Mode 7 background again to the whole planet Zebus. At the same time though, there's a small sprite of the planet behind it, which we see becoming visible as the zoom is occurring, achieved by fading out the palette for the Mode 7 background, while fading in the palette for the sprites simultaneously. Eventually, the Mode 7 planet fades out completely, and the game switches to Mode 1 to combine with the sprite layer in order to render the explosion. Finally, Samus's ship reappears from the blast as a Mode 7 background, and flies towards the screen to complete the cutscene, with the remains of the planet as a sprite behind it. And yes, of course I saved the animals. Wow, so much stuff happening here for a cutscene that only runs for about 35 seconds. It's an amazing game from start to finish. The last thing I wanted to cover in this video isn't really a question, but I felt it was worth including. Kawa Oni-chan says, "Ironic to see White Pointer called the driving section of Batman Returns Mode 7. This is referring to a video I made a couple of years ago now, before I really started making these tech videos, where I was talking about Super Nintendo games with mature themes. Batman Returns was one of those games. It's mostly a beat 'em up, but there's one level where you're driving the Batmobile, and I say that it makes use of Mode 7. This comment seems to be implying that I was mistaken. So, was I wrong? Only one way to find out. Here's the stage in question, speeding down the road in the Batmobile and taking out bad guys like a boss. Straight away, we can see that it looks like there's a screen split happening here. And there is, on line 130 to be exact. The top segment of the screen is displaying in Mode 1 to draw the city skyline and the HUD. And the bottom segment with the road is displaying in Mode 7.
That's a relief.
However, this is worth having a further look because it's kind of an unusual application of it. The Mode 7 tile map is just one short stretch of road. That's it. The Mode 7 scrolling simply moves up this road and loops back to the start over and over again really quickly. It only takes 14 frames to complete a loop. Unlike other games that use Mode 7 for roads or racetracks like this, which have the entire layout defined in the tile map, the bends in the road are not part of the tile map at all. These are simply created with line scrolling. However, impressively, the game still manages to create some fluctuations in height occasionally as well. This is really just 90s Konami showing off. Phew, alright, that's a lot of questions answered. However, I did say this was only the first video I'm making to directly respond to queries, so don't despair if I didn't get to yours in this video. It might be in the next one, so be on the lookout for it. It never ceases to amaze me how ingenious developers were back then to get around technical restrictions and really push these consoles beyond what they were designed to do. I hope this has been helpful, not just to those of you who asked the questions, but anyone else watching that may have also wondered the same things. Hopefully I've solved some of your long-standing mysteries. Be sure to keep leaving questions in the comments if you want to know how certain classic games achieve their end results, and I'll do my best to answer them in future videos. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.